Benjamin Carter, at 10 years of age, sat on one of the small wooden chairs before the slanted stage of the Hope Puppet Theatre, inside a crooked colonial house on Mercy Lane in Savannah, Georgia. He held a yellowed letter dated 1976, and, as he read the words from a father to his son about transforming rejected places into magic, a deep, uncontrollable sob escaped his chest. He cried not from sadness, but from an overwhelming understanding that the parental love he had only seen in his 3 faded photographs truly existed in the world, a love capable of building a universe of joy from ruins. The dust motes dancing in the slivers of light from the boarded-up windows seemed to pause as the sound of his weeping filled the forgotten space, a sound that wasn't of despair, but of a profound and soul-shaking discovery. This single moment in this abandoned place was the first time in 3 years he felt a glimmer of hope, a connection to a world he thought was lost to him forever. This moment of discovery would redefine Benjamin's entire future, proving that even in the darkest of circumstances, a single act of love from the past can illuminate the path forward. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, and that the resilience of the human spirit is something worth celebrating, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your engagement helps these narratives reach more people who need to hear them. Please take a moment to leave a like on this story and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a chapter of these incredible journeys. We appreciate your support more than you know, as it allows us to continue sharing powerful accounts of survival and hope with the world. Every interaction makes a significant difference and helps our community grow stronger with each new story we tell together. But to understand why an abandoned puppet theatre became the catalyst for Benjamin's first tear of relief in 3 long years, one must go back 4 days. We need to rewind the clock to a humid Thursday afternoon at his godfather's corn dog stand, a place reeking of hot oil and shattered promises. It was there, amidst the noise of the city market and the endless demands of his work, that he overheard the casual negotiation that revealed the exact price of his own life. To truly comprehend the profound meaning of the letter he held in his hands, we must first witness the suffocating reality he was forced to endure, a reality that made a crooked, forgotten house feel like the safest place on earth. His journey to this small, dusty stage began not with a choice, but with the terrifying certainty that he had to escape or be sold. 4 days before his discovery in the crooked house, Benjamin Carter's world was a small, greasy corner of the Savannah city market. For 3 years, ever since the storm that claimed his parents and their fishing boat, he had lived under the guardianship of Clay and Sonia Miller. He was 10 years old, but the weight of his existence felt much older. The promise made to his parents, a promise of a loving home with his godparents, had dissolved as quickly as the sea foam on the shore. Haven Street was not a haven, and the Miller's house was not a home. It was merely a place he returned to after his work was done, a place where he was tolerated but never embraced. His life had become a silent, repeating cycle of labor and exhaustion, a stark contrast to the memories of laughter and sea salt that he clung to from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. His room, if it could be called that, was a lean-to structure attached to the back of the house, more of a glorified shed than a bedroom. Its walls were unfinished plywood, and the roof was a large, blue plastic tarp that sagged in the middle and drummed loudly during the frequent Georgia rainstorms. A musty, damp smell always lingered in the air, clinging to the thin mattress on the floor and the single threadbare blanket he used for warmth. The space was physically and emotionally detached from the main house, a clear boundary marking him as separate from the family. He could hear the faint sounds of the television, the laughter of the Millers' 2 biological children, and the low murmur of conversation through the thin wall, but he was never a part of it. He was an outsider living on the periphery of their lives. From 6 in the morning until well after the sun had set at 8 in the evening, Benjamin's world was the corn dog stand. It was a permanent fixture in the bustling market, a small metal box that perpetually smelled of hot oil, burnt sugar, and cleaning chemicals. The roar of the deep fryers was a constant companion, a sizzling soundtrack to his days. He stood on a wooden crate to reach the counters, his small hands working tirelessly to keep up with the endless flow of tourists and locals. The floor was always slick with a film of grease, a treacherous surface he learned to navigate with careful, shuffling steps. This stand was his school, his playground, and his prison, a place where the vibrant life of Savannah passed by just feet away, yet remained completely out of his reach, a colorful blur he could only observe. His duties were relentless and far too demanding for a child his age. He was responsible for mixing the thick, yellow batter for the corn dogs, carefully dipping each one before lowering it into the scalding oil. He learned to operate the funnel cake dispenser, his arms aching as he swirled the sweet dough into intricate patterns. When he wasn't cooking, he was cleaning, wiping down sticky counters, mopping the greasy floor, and taking out bags of trash that were almost as big as he was. The most dreaded task was hauling the heavy propane tanks from the storage locker to the stand, his small frame straining under the weight. Each day was a marathon of physical exertion that left his muscles sore and his mind numb. A routine designed to extract the maximum amount of labor from his small body without a single thought for his well-being. Clay Miller, his godfather, was the architect of this grueling existence. A large man with a perpetually sour expression and a voice that carried over the market noise, Clay saw Benjamin not as a godson but as an unpaid employee. He rarely used the boy's name, preferring to bark commands like batter or clean or hurry up. There was no praise for a job well done, only sharp criticism for the slightest mistake. Clay's presence was a constant source of anxiety, a heavy cloud of disapproval that hung over the stand. Benjamin learned to anticipate his moods, to work faster when he heard Clay's heavy footsteps approaching, and to make himself as small and invisible as possible. He was a ghost in his own life, a silent operator of the machinery that funded the Miller family's comfort, while he himself was afforded none. Sonia Miller and her 2 children completed the picture of neglect. While Clay was the overt taskmaster, Sonia's cruelty was one of quiet, cutting indifference. She would visit the stand with her children, ordering food as if Benjamin were a stranger, and never acknowledging the long hours he worked. She bought new clothes and toys for her own son and daughter, while Benjamin wore the same 2 pairs of faded shorts and t-shirts for an entire year. The Miller children, having learned from their parents, treated him with a mixture of disdain and invisibility. They would run past his lean-to in the backyard without a glance, their laughter a painful reminder of the childhood he was being denied. He was a functional part of the household's economy, but entirely absent from its emotional landscape. A tool to be used but never cared for. His meals were a stark and daily reminder of his status. He was never permitted to eat with the family at their dinner table. Instead, he waited until they had all finished, until the sounds from the kitchen died down before he was allowed to enter. There, he would find the leftovers on the counter. Most nights, it was a meager portion of cold vegetables or the hardened remnants of a casserole scraped from the serving dishes into a bowl. He ate alone, standing by the counter, before retreating to his damp lean-to for a few hours of restless sleep. The gnawing hunger in his stomach was a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the emotional starvation he endured every single day. He learned to suppress the ache, to ignore it, just as he learned to suppress every other need and emotion that a child should be allowed to feel. To survive, Benjamin built a fortress inside his own mind. He learned to perform his tasks with mechanical precision, detaching his thoughts from the physical strain and the emotional emptiness of his reality. He became an expert observer, a silent watcher of the world around him, noticing details others missed but never speaking of them. He learned that silence was safety, and that drawing attention to himself only brought trouble. The vibrant, talkative boy his parents had known was buried deep beneath layers of self-preservation. In the eyes of the world, he was just a quiet kid helping at a food stand. No one saw the lonely soul trapped inside, a soul who had learned that his worth was measured only by the number of corn dogs he could fry in an hour. His only escape, his only connection to the love he once knew, was a small, tattered envelope he kept hidden under his mattress. Inside were 3 faded photographs of his parents, Michael and Sarah. In one, they were standing on the deck of their fishing boat, the Sea Lark, and their arms around each other, squinting against the bright sun with wide, happy smiles. In another, his father was holding up a large fish, laughing, while his mother looked on with affection. The last was of the 3 of them. A 7-year-old Benjamin held securely between them, his face beaming. These images were his most precious possessions, the tangible proof that he was once cherished. He would study their faces in the dark, tracing their smiles with his finger, whispering to them, asking them for the strength to endure one more day. He understood the concept of money with a painful clarity. He saw it exchange hands hundreds of times a day at the stand, watch Clay count a thick wad of bills every night before closing. He knew that his labor produced this money, yet not a single dollar ever made its way into his own hands. The system was simple and brutal. He provided the work, and the millers reaped all the rewards. This fundamental injustice settled deep in his bones, a cold, hard knot of awareness that he was being used. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he understood the feeling of exploitation. He knew that the life they were living, the new clothes for their children, the weekend trips he heard them plan, was being paid for with his sweat, his exhaustion, and his stolen childhood. A subtle, unsettling feeling that things were even worse than they appeared began to surface in small, fragmented moments. Once, he saw Sonia quickly hide an official-looking envelope from the mailbox before Clay could see it. Another time, he overheard a hushed, angry phone call where Sonia mentioned survivor benefits and the name of his father. These were just whispers, disconnected pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble, but they planted a seed of deep unease. He sensed a layer of deception running beneath the surface of their neglect, a secret that was being carefully guarded. It was a vague premonition, a shadow in his peripheral vision, suggesting that his role in their lives was not just one of an unpaid servant, but something more calculated and sinister, and so his life settled into this bleak, unchanging rhythm. Wake, work, eat leftovers, sleep, repeat. It was a life devoid of joy, affection, or hope for the future. He existed in a state of suspended animation, his spirit worn down by the daily grind of servitude and the profound loneliness of being utterly forgotten by the people who were supposed to protect him. The world had shrunk to the size of the greasy food stand and the damp, lonely lean-to. He had accepted this reality because he had no other choice. He did not yet know that this fragile, oppressive stability was about to be shattered, and that the quiet negotiation happening in a nearby bar was about to force him to find a courage he never knew he possessed. The fragile sense of normalcy, thin as it was, shattered on a humid Thursday afternoon. Benjamin was performing one of his most hated tasks, scraping the thick, cooled grease from the sides of the large, deep fryer, a job reserved for the slow hours between the lunch rush and the evening crowd. The air was heavy with the smell of old oil and the distant sounds of the city market winding down. It was during this lull that his godfather's voice, loud and brash, carried over from the patio of the adjacent bar where he often met with other vendors. Clay was not yelling, but his voice had a boastful, triumphant quality that was unusual, a tone that immediately snagged Benjamin's attention. He paused his scraping, the metal tool held tight in his hand, and tilted his head, listening intently as the words began to cut through the ambient noise, each one a sharp, distinct blow against the wall of his bleak reality. He recognized the other voice as belonging to a man who ran a produce stall nearby, a man Clay often complained to about his supposed hardships. But today, the complaints were gone, replaced by an air of smug satisfaction. Clay was describing a deal he had just finalized, a brilliant solution to his financial woes. He spoke of a restaurant owner he knew, a man with a large, busy establishment in Atlanta, a city that to Benjamin sounded as distant and foreign as the moon. The name of the city hung in the air, a symbol of separation and finality. Benjamin felt a cold dread begin to creep up his spine. He pressed himself closer to the thin metal wall of the stand, straining to hear every word, his mind racing to connect the pieces of this conversation that was so clearly, so terrifyingly, about him and his future. The nature of the deal was laid out with sickening clarity. Clay explained that the restaurant owner needed a reliable kitchen hand, someone who would work without complaint and live on site. The arrangement was perfect, he boasted. For the sum of $400 a month, paid directly to Clay in cash, Benjamin would be sent to Atlanta. The money was not a salary for Benjamin. It was a fee paid to his godfather for supplying the labor. The number echoed in Benjamin's head. $400. He had seen Clay count out that much money in a single evening's earnings. He now understood that this was his price, the monthly value of his entire existence, a transaction that erased him as a person and redefined him as a source of passive income, a tradable asset. The specifics of his new life were described in casual, dismissive terms. He would live in a small room behind the restaurant, a space even smaller and more isolated than his current lean-to. His work would be from dawn until late at night, 7 days a week, with no breaks and no days off. He would be responsible for washing dishes, mopping floors, and doing whatever menial tasks the kitchen staff required. Clay presented this as a good opportunity, a chance for Benjamin to learn a trade, but the words were hollow. Benjamin heard the truth beneath the lie. It was a sentence to a life of even more relentless servitude, stripped of any familiar surroundings, in a place where he would know no one and have no one to turn to. He was not being sent away for his own good. He was being permanently disposed of. What broke him, what truly extinguished the last flicker of hope that he might be seen as family, was the sound of Clay's laughter. After laying out the terms of the deal, his godfather let out a short, harsh laugh and declared that he would finally be rid of the burden left by his parents. He added that the best part was that he would still make a little cash every month from the boy. The word burden struck Benjamin with the force of a physical blow. It confirmed everything he had feared, every unspoken message of his 3 years with the Millers. He was not a godson to be loved or a child to be protected. He was an inconvenience, a financial drain that was finally being converted into a profitable enterprise. The cold, transactional nature of the statement was absolute and undeniable. In that moment, the world around Benjamin seemed to warp and slow down. The distant chatter of the market faded to a dull hum. The smell of the grease in the fryer became nauseating, and the metal scraper felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He understood with a chilling, soul-deep certainty that his life was not his own. He was a piece on a board, being moved and sold by a player who felt nothing for him. The quiet deceptions he had sensed before, the hidden mail, the hushed phone calls, all snapped into focus. This was not a sudden decision. This was the culmination of a long-held plan, a calculated strategy to exploit him until a more profitable option became available. He was not just being neglected, he was being actively and deliberately sold. The conversation shifted to logistics, and Benjamin learned that this was not a distant possibility, but an imminent reality. Clay mentioned that the restaurant owner wanted him in Atlanta by the end of the following week. A timeline had been set. He had less than 7 days before he would be put on a bus and sent away forever. A wave of panic washed over him, so intense it made him feel dizzy. He couldn't cry out, he couldn't run to anyone for help. Who would he tell? The Millers were his legal guardians. To the outside world, they were the benevolent family who had taken in an orphan. No one would believe the quiet, 10-year-old boy over the word of his seemingly responsible godfather. He was trapped, cornered by a system that was supposed to protect him, but instead enabled his abuser. He realized that there was no way to appeal to Clay's conscience because he had none. There was no room for negotiation or pleading. The decision had been made, the deal had been struck, and his fate had been sealed by a handshake on a bar patio. To remain in the house on Haven Street was to accept this future, to wait passively to be packaged and shipped off like cargo. The idea of staying another night under that roof, eating their leftover food, and looking into their faces while knowing they had sold him was unbearable. The illusion of a home, however broken, was completely shattered. There was no safety to be found with the Millers, only a countdown to a new, more terrible form of imprisonment. The threat was no longer a vague feeling of unease or a collection of disconnected clues. It was a concrete plan with a date, a destination, and a price tag. It was clear, it was unequivocal, and it was irreversible. The systematic suffering he had endured for 3 years was not the end. It was merely a prelude to something far worse. As Clay and the other man moved on to other topics, their laughter drifting over the wall, Benjamin stood frozen in the greasy confines of the stand. He was no longer just an orphan or an unpaid worker. He was a product about to be delivered, and in the silent, terrified core of his being, a new and desperate thought began to form, not as a choice, but as the only possible response to this absolute certainty, he had to run. The world fell away, leaving only the sound of Clay's triumphant voice echoing in his mind. The grease scraper felt impossibly heavy, a tool from a life that was no longer his. In that moment, standing in the suffocating heat of the corndog stand, a decision crystallized within Benjamin, not as an act of bravery, but as a simple, undeniable fact of survival. He could not go to Atlanta. He could not be sold. Therefore he had to leave. The thought was cold and clear, cutting through the panic like a shard of ice. He finished his work with a strange, detached precision, his hands moving automatically, while his mind began to race, constructing the fragile scaffolding of a plan. Every scrape of metal on metal, every wiped counter, was a final act in a life he was about to abandon forever. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not sleep in his lean-to the next night. That evening was a masterclass in invisibility, a performance for an audience that had never truly watched him anyway. He moved through his routine with a quiet obedience that belied the frantic energy surging through him. He helped Clay close the stand, his eyes downcast, his face a carefully constructed mask of submission. Back at the house on Haven Street, he ate the cold leftovers Sonia had left on the counter, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not speak. He did not make eye contact. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of their lives for the last time. Every normal action felt like a lie, a necessary deception to preserve the element of surprise. He needed them to believe he was the same broken, compliant boy he had been that morning. His survival now depended on their complete and utter ignorance of the fire they had just ignited within him. From the damp confines of his lean-to, he became a hunter, and the sounds of the house were his prey. He had spent 3 years listening to the rhythms of the Miller family, but tonight he listened with a new, desperate intent. He catalogued each noise, the blare of the television, the sharp commands from Sonia to her children, the eventual creak of their bedroom doors closing. He waited for the final, crucial sound. Around midnight, it began. The deep, rhythmic, saw-like snore that emanated from Clay's room. It was a sound he had always despised, a nightly reminder of the man who controlled his life. But tonight, it was a signal. It was the sound of opportunity, the rumbling bass note of his escape. He knew Clay was a heavy sleeper, a man lost to the world once he was down. That predictable, guttural sound was the key to his freedom. With the house cloaked in a silence broken only by the snoring, he began his preparations. His movements were swift and silent, honed by years of trying not to draw attention to himself. He pulled his old, faded blue school backpack from beneath his mattress, the canvas stiff and smelling of mildew. First, he secured his most precious cargo. He took out the small, tattered envelope containing the 3 photographs of his parents. He paused, his fingers tracing the smiling face of his mother and the laughing eyes of his father. They were his only connection to a life where he was loved, the only proof that such a world had ever existed. They were his reason, his compass, and his destination. Carefully, he tucked the envelope into the bag's small inner pocket, zipping it shut. Whatever happened, he would not lose them. Next came the practicalities of his journey into the unknown. He had managed to secret away 2 hard bread rolls from the stand earlier that day, a small act of defiance he hadn't even understood at the time. He wrapped them carefully in a paper napkin and placed them beside the envelope. They were a pathetic provision, but they were all he had. Then he retrieved the single most valuable physical object he possessed, a worn, folded $10 bill. A tourist, seeing the exhaustion on his face, had pressed it into his hand a month prior with a kind smile. He had hidden it immediately, saving it for a crisis he couldn't name. This was it. The bill felt impossibly large in his small hand, a thin piece of paper that represented a chance. With his meager supplies packed, the backpack felt both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. Time began to warp, each second stretching into a minute, each minute an hour. He sat on the edge of his thin mattress, the backpack clutched tightly to his chest, listening. Every gust of wind, every distant siren, every creak of the old house sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He had set a deadline in his mind, 2 in the morning. It seemed a time deep enough into the night that the world would be at its most still, its darkest. The waiting was an agony, a silent war waged in his own mind. A voice of fear whispered that he was a fool, a 10-year-old boy who would be caught or starve. It told him to lie down, to accept his fate in Atlanta, to surrender. The city outside was vast and dangerous, and he was completely, utterly alone. But then another sound would rise to counter the fear, the memory of Clay Miller's cruel, dismissive laughter as he described selling him for $400 a month. That memory was a fire, burning away the tendrils of doubt. He pictured the grimy kitchen in Atlanta, the endless stacks of dishes, the lonely room that would be his new cage. He thought of the word Clay had used, burden. He was not a burden. He was the son of Michael and Sarah Carter, the laughing boy in the photograph. This was not an act of childish rebellion, it was an act of self-reclamation. He was running not just from the Millers, but toward the memory of his parents, toward the possibility of a life where he was more than a number in a ledger. The decision was no longer a choice, it was the only thing left to do. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the snoring from the main house remained a deep and unbroken rhythm. It was time. He pulled on his worn sneakers, lacing them tightly without making a sound. He stood and shouldered the backpack, its weight a grounding presence on his small frame. He took one final sweeping look at the dark, damp lean-to, the plywood walls and the sagging tarp roof. He felt no nostalgia, no sadness, only the cold, sharp relief of a prisoner on the verge of liberation. He moved to the door, his hand hovering over the simple wooden latch. This was the threshold. On one side was the suffocating certainty of his life with the Millers. On the other was a terrifying, absolute unknown. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of freedom and fear, and gently, silently, he pushed the door open. The cool, humid night air was a shock against his skin, a stark contrast to the stale, recycled atmosphere of his lean-to. He stepped out onto the damp grass, his worn sneakers making no sound. For a moment, he just stood there, a small silhouette against the dark shape of the Miller house, the rhythmic snoring from within a faint, monstrous heartbeat. This was it, the point of no return. With a final, silent pull, he eased the shed door closed until he heard the soft click of the latch. That simple sound was a gavel falling, a sentence passed on his old life. He turned his back on the only place he had known for 3 years and melted into the deep shadows that pooled at the edge of the yard. His escape now a tangible, terrifying reality. He was no longer waiting for his fate. He was running to meet it, alone in the sleeping world. His first challenge was the backyard itself, a familiar space that had transformed into a landscape of treacherous obstacles in the dark. He navigated by memory, his hands outstretched to feel for the clothesline post, his feet carefully avoiding the loose paving stone that always wobbled near the back gate. Every rustle of leaves, every distant moan of the wind sounded like an alarm about to be raised. A neighbor's dog let out a single sharp bark, and Benjamin froze, his body rigid, his breath caught in his throat. He waited, counting the seconds, expecting lights to flash on, a door to be thrown open. But the bark faded into silence, replaced once again by the hum of the city at rest. He exhaled slowly, a shaky cloud of vapor in the cool air, and continued his silent trek toward the alley that promised an exit. Reaching the mouth of the alley, he peered onto the empty street. The world under the orange glow of the street lamps was a different planet. The familiar, bustling city he knew from the stand was gone, replaced by a silent, empty stage. The long, distorted shadows cast by parked cars and ancient oak trees seemed to writhe and stretch, like grasping fingers reaching for him. He had to cross the open street to get to the next block, a wide, exposed space with no cover. A wave of fear washed over him. Should he run, drawing attention with his frantic movement, or walk, pretending he had a reason to be out at this hour? He chose to walk. He forced his legs into a steady, measured pace, his head down, the backpack a heavy, conspicuous weight on his shoulders. Each step on the pavement felt like a drumbeat announcing his illicit freedom. He began his descent from Cathedral Bluff, the grand architecture of Savannah standing as silent, imposing sentinels. He passed the towering spires of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, a place he had only ever seen from a distance, its stained glass windows now dark, sleeping eyes. The beautiful historic homes with their wrought-iron balconies and perfectly manicured gardens seemed to judge him, their quiet elegance a stark reminder of his own station. He was a creature of the greasy alleyways and back rooms, a ghost now haunting the pristine avenues of the city's heart. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were walking through a museum exhibit of a life he could never touch, a world he was not meant to inhabit. He quickened his pace, eager to leave the polished, orderly streets behind for something more forgiving. A change in the air signaled a coming shift. A soft, almost imperceptible mist began to fall, clinging to his hair and the thin fabric of his shirt. At first, he worried it would soak his meager supplies, but he soon realized the rain was a gift. The gentle drizzle softened the edges of the world, blurring the harsh lines of the buildings and muffling the sound of his own footsteps on the old cobblestones. It created a moving curtain of grey between him and any potential observer, a shield of anonymity granted by the weather. He tilted his face up to the sky, letting the cool droplets run down his cheeks, washing away the grime and sweat of the corn-dog stand. For a brief moment, the rain felt like a baptism, a cleansing ritual marking the beginning of his new, uncertain life. Emboldened by his cloak of rain, he took a turn down a narrow, unfamiliar lane, hoping it was a shortcut. The brick walls on either side seemed to close in on him, the darkness growing deeper, swallowing the faint glow from the main street. The lane ended abruptly in a high, ivy-covered wall. It was a dead end. A surge of pure panic, cold and sharp, shot through him. He had wasted precious time and was now trapped. He heard a sudden clatter nearby, a discarded bottle rolling across the stones, and he flattened himself against the cold, wet brick, his heart hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, listening, certain he had been discovered. But there was only silence. He had to force himself to move, to backtrack slowly out of the dark passage, and back into the relative light. His mistake, a harsh lesson in the unforgiving geography of the night. He found his way back to a wider street, his brief confidence shattered. He was more cautious now, his initial burst of adrenaline replaced by a gnawing anxiety. He knew he couldn't wander aimlessly. He needed a destination, or at least a direction. An instinct born from 3 years of feeling like an outcast guided his feet. He began moving toward the oldest, most neglected part of the city, the areas tourists avoided, where the historic preservation gave way to decay. He reasoned that in a place full of forgotten buildings and overlooked corners, one more forgotten boy might blend in. It was a sad, childish logic, but it was the only strategy he had. He was drawn to the broken places, believing that they would be less likely to reject him, that his own damage would be camouflaged among their crumbling facades. The rain was no longer a gentle mist. It intensified into a steady, cold downpour, the kind of persistent southern rain that soaks everything in minutes. His thin t-shirt was plastered to his skin, and a deep chill began to seep into his bones. He hunched his shoulders, trying to protect the backpack, acutely aware of the 2 precious bread rolls inside turning to mush. The $10 bill he had so carefully folded suddenly felt like a useless, flimsy piece of paper against the growing misery of the storm. The escape, which had felt like a desperate act of liberation, was now devolving into a miserable, shivering ordeal. The urgency shifted. He was no longer just running from Clay Miller. He was now racing against the elements, a new and impartial enemy that threatened to defeat him with cold and exhaustion. He finally turned onto a street sign that read, Mercy Lane. The name seemed like a bitter joke. The lane was poorly lit, the cobblestones uneven and treacherous. The buildings here were different, older and more weary than the grand homes he had passed earlier. And then he saw it. It stood at a strange, unsettling angle, an 18th-century colonial house that was visibly leaning to its left, as if tired of standing straight. Its walls were crooked, its paint was peeling in long strips, and the roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. It was the kind of place people whispered about, a structure that seemed to be actively surrendering to gravity and time. But to Benjamin, soaked and shivering, it wasn't an eyesore or a hazard. It was a possibility. It was shelter. He approached the crooked house with a strange reverence, his feet slowing as he drew closer. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripping into his eyes. From this vantage, the house looked even more derelict, a forgotten relic from another century. He scanned the dark windows, searching for any sign of life, any flicker of light that would signal danger. There was nothing but black emptiness. He reached the front door, a massive slab of dark, weathered wood that looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. He braced himself for disappointment, fully expecting it to be locked and bolted, another dead end. He placed his small, trembling hand on the cold, damp surface, the rough grain of the old wood a solid, unyielding presence beneath his palm. He gathered his strength for one small, hopeless push. He leaned his slight weight against the door. To his astonishment, it moved. There was a low, groaning creak of ancient, rusted hinges, but it swung inward. It had not been locked, not even fully latched, merely resting in its frame as if waiting for him. A sliver of profound darkness opened up before him, and from it came a gust of air that smelled of dry dust, decaying paper, and a deep, undisturbed silence. He didn't hesitate for a second. The promise of a roof, any roof, was too powerful to ignore. He slipped through the opening into the pitch-black interior and, using both hands, pulled the heavy door closed behind him. It settled back into its frame with a deep, resonant thud that echoed in the cavernous space, finally shutting out the sound of the relentless rain and the world that had cast him out. The darkness inside the crooked house was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed the light and sound from the outside world. Benjamin stood perfectly still just inside the door, his breath catching in his throat as the heavy wood thudded shut behind him. The relentless drumming of the rain was instantly muffled, replaced by a profound echoing silence. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of ancient, undisturbed dust, of brittle paper and decaying wood. For the first time in hours, he was not cold or wet. A wave of immense relief washed over him, so powerful it made his knees feel weak. He was hidden. He was safe from the storm and, for now, safe from the world that was hunting him. He leaned his back against the door, the solid wood a comforting presence, and simply breathed in the quiet, musty air of his newfound, temporary sanctuary. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, faint slivers of grey light began to emerge, filtering through grime-caked windows and cracks in the boarded-up facade. The space was not what he had expected. It was not a series of small, cluttered rooms, but one vast, open chamber that seemed to occupy the entire ground floor of the house. The ceiling was high, lost in the shadows above, and the wooden floorboards stretched out before him into the darkness. There was no furniture in the conventional sense, no tables or sofas, which only added to the cavernous, empty feeling of the place. It felt less like a home and more like a hall, a place built for gatherings that had long since been forgotten. He took a tentative step forward, his worn sneaker making a soft scuffing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, his initial fear of the unknown slowly being replaced by a deep and abiding curiosity. He moved deeper into the room, his small frame a solitary figure in the vast, dusty space. A strange sense of peace settled over him. Unlike the miller's house, which was filled with a tense, angry energy, even in its quietest moments, this crooked house felt calm. It felt dormant, like a sleeping giant, not menacing. He ran his hand along a wooden wall, the peeling paint flaking away under his touch, and felt a connection to the sheer age of the place. It had stood here for centuries, watching the city of Savannah grow and change around it, and it held its secrets close. He felt like a secret himself, a small, lost boy who had found a hiding place within a much larger one. The physical shelter from the rain was becoming an emotional one as well, the thick, silent walls providing a barrier against the panic and despair that had driven him out into the night. It was then that he saw the most peculiar feature of the room. In the center, bathed in the softest of the grey light, was a small wooden stage. It was not grand or ornate, but simple and clearly handmade. What was most striking was its construction. It was built at a deliberate angle, canted to the right to perfectly counteract the severe leftward lean of the house itself. The surface of the stage, therefore, was perfectly level. This was not an accident of decay. It was an act of incredible intention and care, a thoughtful piece of engineering designed to create a single point of stability, in a world that was fundamentally crooked. Benjamin stared at it, mesmerized. Someone had looked at this broken, slanted floor and, instead of trying to fix it, had built something beautiful and functional right on top of its imperfection. The sight resonated deep within him, a silent testament to the power of creation over decay. His gaze then drifted from the stage to the walls surrounding it. Hanging from wooden pegs in neat, orderly rows were dozens of marionettes. They were silent, motionless figures, their strings dangling loosely. As he moved closer, he could see they were not store-bought toys, but intricate, hand-carved works of art. Each one had a distinct personality etched into its wooden face. There were figures he vaguely recognized from old stories his mother used to read to him: a clever rabbit with long ears, a sly-looking fox in a waistcoat, a mournful woman in a flowing gown who looked like a ghost from a local legend. They were characters from the deep well of Southern folklore, a silent, colorful audience waiting for a show that had ended long ago. The sheer number of them and the detail in their creation spoke of a deep and sustained passion, a love for storytelling that filled the entire room with its quiet, ghostly presence. Completing the scene was another detail that made his heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. Arranged in a neat semicircle before the slanted stage were several rows of small, child-sized wooden chairs. They were empty now, coated in a thin layer of dust, but it was easy to imagine them filled with the ghosts of children, their faces upturned, watching a performance in rapt attention. This was not just a house, it had been a theater. A puppet theater built specifically for children. It was a place designed for joy, for laughter, for magic. It was the absolute antithesis of the greasy corn dog stand, the world of endless, joyless labor he had just escaped. He slowly walked among the tiny chairs, his fingers grazing their dusty backs, and felt a profound sense of loss for a childhood of wonder that he had never known, but could so vividly imagine in this forgotten space. And that is how Benjamin Carter arrived at the moment that began this entire story, standing in the heart of a forgotten puppet theater inside a crooked house on Mercy Lane. He was no longer just a runaway shivering from the rain. He was an explorer who had stumbled upon a lost world. He felt an irresistible pull toward the stage, as if it were the magnetic center of this strange universe. He stepped onto its level surface, the wood solid beneath his feet, and looked out at the empty chairs. For a fleeting second he felt what it must have been like to be the storyteller, the creator of magic in this special room. He knelt, running his hand across the smooth, worn planks, a surface polished by countless performances, and felt a connection to the unknown person who had poured so much love into this broken place. As he knelt there on the stage, his eyes scanned the space beneath it, a dark void between the floorboards and the slanted foundation of the house. Tucked away in the deepest corner, almost completely hidden in shadow, was a dark shape that didn't belong. It was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its surface dark with age. It didn't look like a piece of debris. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately, a treasure hidden for safekeeping. A new kind of energy, a sharp spike of anticipation, cut through his exhaustion. He lay down on his stomach, the dusty wood cool against his cheek, and stretched his arm as far as it could go into the darkness under the stage. His fingers brushed against the rough grain of the box. It was heavy, solid. He hooked his fingers around the edge and began to slide it slowly, carefully out into the dim light. The box was surprisingly well preserved, made of a dark, sturdy wood with a simple brass latch on the front. It was not locked. He sat up on his knees, placing the box before him on the stage, his heart now hammering against his ribs with a rhythm of nervous excitement. This felt important. It felt like the reason he had been drawn to this specific house, to this specific room. With trembling hands, he lifted the small brass latch. It opened with a soft, metallic click. He paused for a beat, his breath held tight in his chest, before slowly lifting the heavy wooden lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like yellowed newspaper clippings, were several thin notebooks filled with elegant, looping handwriting, and resting directly on top of them, catching the faint grey light, was a single, thick envelope, its paper yellowed with age, addressed in the very same script. He knew with an unshakable certainty that he had to read it. His small, trembling fingers carefully unfolded the thick, yellowed paper. The letter was dated October 1976. The handwriting was elegant and strong, a dark blue ink that had faded only slightly over the decades. It began not with a formal greeting, but with a deeply personal one, "To our dearest Robert." Benjamin felt a strange pang of intrusion, as if he were reading something sacred and not meant for his eyes. The words seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a message sealed in time, waiting patiently in the dark for a reader. He leaned closer, the faint light from the boarded windows just enough to illuminate the page, and began to read the story of the crooked house, a story that would unravel the tightly wound knot of pain he had carried in his chest for 3 long years. He was not just reading a letter, he was unearthing a history, a testament to a kind of love he had almost forgotten could possibly exist in the world. The author introduced himself as Silas Carter, and he wrote of his wife Isabel, with a warmth that seemed to rise from the page itself. He explained that he was writing this letter on their son Robert's 10th birthday, tucking it away in the box of scripts as a time capsule. He imagined an older Robert, perhaps a man with a family of his own, returning to this place and finding these words, a reminder of the magic they had built together. The intention was so pure, so filled with a forward-looking love, that it took Benjamin's breath away. This was not a document of ownership or a list of instructions. It was a pure and simple gift of memory, a father's attempt to preserve a moment of profound family joy for his son to cherish forever. The concept of a parent, thinking so carefully about their child's future feelings, was a foreign and overwhelmingly beautiful idea to him. Silas then wrote about the house itself, describing how they had found it abandoned and leaning, a structure everyone else on Mercy Lane had written off as a lost cause. "People saw a crooked house," Henry wrote, "but your mother and we saw a stage." He explained that they chose this broken place on purpose. They wanted to teach their son Robert a lesson that no school could offer, that the most beautiful things are often born from what the world has rejected. They saw the building's slant not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a unique characteristic to be embraced, a foundation upon which they could build something truly original. This philosophy of finding value in the discarded and strength in imperfection resonated in the quiet room, a direct challenge to the brutal logic of the world Benjamin had just escaped, a world where any perceived flaw was a reason for dismissal. The letter then revealed the true purpose of their work. The Hope Puppet Theatre, as they called it, was never intended to be a business to make money. It was a personal, elaborate and loving gift for their son. Robert, at 10 years old, was the same age Benjamin was now. As he read this, a shiver traced its way down Benjamin's spine. While he was being forced to work from dawn until dusk to generate income for his godparents, this other 10-year-old boy, Robert, had a world of fantasy constructed for him out of pure, unconditional love. The Carters' entire project was an investment in their son's happiness, a way to fill his childhood with stories, creativity, and wonder. The stark contrast between his own life of servitude and Robert's life of cherished imagination was a chasm so wide and deep it felt like it could swallow him whole. Silas dedicated an entire paragraph to the slanted stage, the very stage upon which Benjamin now sat. He explained that its level surface in the crooked room was a metaphor. "Life will often feel like it is tilted against you, son," the letter read, "but you always have the power to build a level place to stand, a place to create your own story." This was the core of their gift to Robert. Not just a theatre, but a lesson in resilience. It was a message that you did not have to fix the world's imperfections to find your balance within it. You could build upon them. For Benjamin, who had felt so powerless for so long, these words were a revelation. They were a grant of agency, a quiet suggestion that he too could build something steady for himself, even in the midst of a life that felt fundamentally broken and unfair. The letter continued, painting a vivid picture of the theatre's creation. Silas described the scent of sawdust as he cut the planks for the stage and the small chairs. He wrote of Isabel sitting by the window for hours, her hands patiently carving the expressive faces of the marionettes, bringing characters from southern folklore to life with her skill and love. He even described young Robert, watching them with wide-eyed wonder, sometimes offering his own crayon drawings as blueprints for new puppets. It was a portrait of a family united in a joyful, creative act, their love made tangible in the wood, paint and fabric that surrounded Benjamin in the dusty room. He could almost hear their laughter echoing in the silence, a ghost of a happiness so profound it seemed to have permanently soaked into the very walls of the house. And as he read, the first tear escaped. It was not a tear of sadness for what he had lost, but a tear of overwhelming recognition for what he had just found. The faded photographs of his own parents were proof that he was once loved. But this letter, this theater, was proof that such love was a powerful world-building force. It was real. It wasn't just a fleeting memory or a story from a book. It was a force capable of transforming a derelict house into a haven of magic for a child. The love described by Silas Carter was not a passive emotion. It was an active, creative, and protective power. The sob that had been caught in his throat for 3 years began to break free, a physical release of a pain he didn't even know he was still holding on to so tightly. He read the signature at the bottom of the letter, and his world tilted on its axis for a second time. With all the love in our hearts, your parents Silas and Isabel Carter. Carter, the same last name as his own. He knew, logically, that it was likely a coincidence in a city as old as Savannah. But in the magical realism of this forgotten theater, it felt like anything but. It felt like a sign, a thread connecting his own broken story to this one. He was Benjamin Carter. They were the Carters. In that moment he felt a profound and irrational sense of belonging, as if he had been guided to this place by the spirits of his own parents, led to a story that could teach him how to survive. He was not just a random runaway. He was a Carter who had found a story left behind by other Carters, and it made him feel, for the first time in forever, a little less alone in the universe. The brutal contrast between the two families burned in his mind. The Millers, who were bound by a sacred promise to care for him, had seen him as a burden to be monetized, an object to be sold. They lived in a normal, straight house, but everything inside it was crooked and broken. Then there were the Carters, strangers he had never met, who took a crooked house and filled it with a love so straight and true that its legacy was still palpable decades later. They had invested their time, their art and their hearts into building a world for their son, while the Millers had invested their energy into dismantling his. The letter did not just tell a story, it held up a mirror to his life, showing him with perfect clarity the difference between exploitation and devotion, between a house and a home. This realization settled into a profound and life-altering truth. His worth was not conditional. It was not something to be earned through frying corn dogs or cleaning greasy floors. The love Silas and Isabel had for Robert was inherent, given freely and without expectation of repayment. It was a love that existed simply because their son existed. Benjamin understood, in a way that went deeper than words, that this was the love his own parents had for him, the love he saw in their smiling faces in the photographs. He was not a burden. He was a son. The Millers' valuation of him at $400 a month was a lie. His true value was immeasurable, defined not by his utility but by his humanity. In the dusty silence of the theater, Benjamin Carter reclaimed his own worth from the people who had tried to steal it from him. His gaze lifted from the letter and swept across the room again. The silent, hanging marionettes no longer looked like sad, abandoned toys. They were soldiers in an army of love, each one a testament to a mother's patience and a father's dream. The small, empty chairs were not a sign of absence, but a promise of childhood joy fulfilled. The entire theater was a monument. It was proof that even when the world is cruel and transactional, people are capable of building beautiful, selfless things for the people they love. He reached out and let his fingers brush against the wooden arm of the closest marionette, a rabbit with long, elegant ears. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch. It felt like he was connecting with the hands of Isabel Carter herself, shaking hands with the ghost of a love that was strong enough to last. And so the sob that began as a single tear finally broke loose, the sound echoing in the vast, empty room. It was the sound from the beginning of our story, the sound of a 10-year-old boy weeping on a slanted stage. But it was not a cry of despair. It was a cry of profound, soul-shaking relief. It was the sound of 3 years of loneliness, fear and emotional starvation being washed away by the story of a family he had never met. He cried for the love he had lost, but more so for the love he had just discovered was real. He cried because in a crooked house that nobody wanted, he had found undeniable proof that he was worthy of a home. He was crying because, for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of hope. And in that forgotten theater, surrounded by the ghosts of a loving family, Benjamin Carter began to believe that his story was not over. After the catharsis of that first cleansing cry, Benjamin did not leave the crooked house. For 4 days he made the Hope Puppet Theater his entire world. He survived on the last of his bread rolls and water from a dripping pipe in a small back room. But his true nourishment came from the stories that lived in the walls. He carefully took down the marionettes, untangling their strings, and brought them to life on the slanted stage. He moved the clever rabbit and the sly fox, giving them voices in hushed whispers, creating silent dialogues of escape and cunning. In this forgotten sanctuary, surrounded by the tangible evidence of a love he had only ever dreamed of, he was not a runaway hiding from the world. He was a director, a storyteller, the sole audience and performer in a theater that had been waiting decades for one last show. He was finally safe, and in that safety, he began to rediscover the parts of himself that the Millers had tried so hard to erase. On the morning of the 5th day, the heavy front door creaked open, casting a bright, shocking rectangle of sunlight across the dusty floor. Benjamin froze, clutching a wooden rabbit, his heart seizing with terror. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, older, with kind eyes that squinted in the sudden darkness of the room. This was Robert Carter, now in his 60s, a retired playwright visiting the home of his childhood for a quiet moment of nostalgic reflection. He saw not a vagrant, but a small, terrified boy who looked as if he had grown out of the very floorboards of the stage. After a long, silent moment, Robert spoke, his voice gentle. He asked Benjamin what he was doing, and the whole story of the corn dog stand and the $400, spilled out of the boy in a torrent of whispered words. Robert listened, his expression shifting from curiosity to a deep, protective fury. He did not see a burden. He saw a son who had finally found his way home. Robert Carter's actions were swift and decisive. He made a single phone call, and within hours, representatives from Child Protective Services were at the crooked house, listening with grim faces as Benjamin recounted his 3 years of servitude. The investigation that followed was a brutal unraveling of the Millers' quiet cruelty. It uncovered not only the plan to sell Benjamin to the restaurant in Atlanta, but a deeper, more calculated betrayal. For 3 years, Clay and Sonia had been illegally cashing the $600 a month in Social Security survivor benefits that were rightfully Benjamin's. The evidence was undeniable. They lost custody immediately and faced charges of child endangerment and fraud. For Benjamin, there was no triumphant confrontation, only a quiet, profound sense of justice. Robert and his wife Anne, who had long ago accepted they could not have children of their own, began the legal process of adoption. Benjamin Carter was finally, truly, a Carter. Years later, the transformation was complete. The silent, haunted boy was gone, replaced by a confident 21-year-old man whose hands moved with the grace of an artist. Benjamin Carter became an award-winning puppeteer, his shows celebrated for their emotional depth and intricate storytelling. He breathed life into wood and string, telling tales of forgotten creatures and lonely souls who find unexpected kindness in the world. He won a prestigious scholarship to study his craft in Prague, but his heart remained in Savannah, where he worked to restore the Hope Puppet Theater, not as a museum, but as a living, breathing space for the city's children. His work was not just a career, it was a continuation of a legacy, a way of honoring the love of Silas and Isabel, the grandparents of his heart. He proved that the greatest victory against cruelty is not revenge, but the creation of a life filled with purpose, beauty, and unwavering hope. His story was no longer about escaping a cage, but about building a